It's a scene almost too harrowing to imagine. In a land once humming with life, a handful of battered trucks inch through a checkpoint, carrying what little food and medicine they can. Behind them, 2 million people wait, hungry, desperate, uncertain if help will come at all. Until now, global outrage seemed to echo in the background. But this week, something changed. Powerful nations have threatened to turn against a longtime ally. The question isn't only whether Gaza can survive, it's this. Has the scramble for humanitarian aid fractured the world's alliances and unleashed a crisis that could reshape the Middle East order itself? Let's step back. Gaza's descent into humanitarian collapse didn't happen overnight. The roots lie deep in history. After the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Gaza became a haven for refugees, an area just 365 square kilometers suddenly burdened by hundreds of thousands displaced by conflict. International agencies like UNRWA sprang up to provide relief. But even by the late 20th century, Gaza's dependence on humanitarian support was clear and growing. Fast forward to 2007. Following Hamas's electoral victory and the ensuing political split with Fatah, Israel imposed a sweeping blockade. Borders clamped shut. Imports of concrete, steel, even chocolate were scrutinized. While some crossings allowed in humanitarian goods, the economy withered. 80% of Gazans would eventually rely on outside aid just to survive. A population living on the edge, as one UN official put it in 2019. Decades of war and sporadic peace left Gaza's infrastructure teetering. Sewers overflowed. Blackouts became daily reality. The promise of investment after the Oslo Accords faded away, replaced by a cycle of violence and rebuilding, only to be followed by more destruction. Then, the crisis of 2023. On October 7th, militants led by Hamas launched a shocking attack into southern Israel, killing over 1,000 and taking hostages. Israel responded with overwhelming force, airstrikes, ground incursions, and a blockade that cut off Gaza from nearly all fuel, food, and medicine. It was, as one observer memorably said, the world's largest open-air prison, sealed tighter than ever. Within weeks, Gaza's fragile systems collapsed. The UN's Tom Fletcher called the trickle of permitted aid a drop in the ocean of what is urgently needed. The scale of devastation by the summer of 2025 is staggering. Over 53,000 dead, most of them women and children. At least 95% of hospitals are non-functional. The land itself is scarred. Entire urban districts turned to rubble. International aid convoys became rare and risky, often looted before reaching those most in need. The UN warned that 14,000 babies faced imminent death by starvation, with just minutes between life and death as food sat at crossing points, held up by bureaucracy or military tension. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization, said bluntly, "People are already starving, sick, and dying, while food and medicines are minutes away across the border." All the while, Gaza's economy didn't just stumble, it cratered. An 83% contraction, thousands of businesses destroyed, farming halted by bombing and lack of fuel. Families sold the last of their belongings to buy scraps of food. Education? For 1 in 3 households, even that became impossible, as schools were bombed or commandeered for shelter. Tess Ingram of UNICEF summed it up. A handful of trucks is not enough. That does not adhere to humanitarian principles. But it's not just the numbers. The politics of aid delivery became a war zone of its own. Israel argues that shipments have too often been hijacked by Hamas, used not for civilians, but to bolster its rule. In response, new plans for private contractors to distribute aid, with Israeli military oversight, have drawn sharp criticism. UN agencies and NGOs call it unworkable, even dangerous. Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, says bluntly, "We cannot be part of a system that weaponizes aid against the people we serve." The main crossing still in operation, Kerem Shalom, is described by the UN as not safe. And with Israel banning UNRWA from working in Gaza, the thin pipeline of humanitarian support is thinner still. This is the backdrop when, in May 2025, the world's patience appeared to snap. After nearly 3 months where only a handful of aid trucks trickled into Gaza, sometimes as few as 5 per day, some of Israel's closest allies took a stand. France, the UK, and Canada issued a joint statement. Their language? Unusually blunt. The aid being allowed in was wholly inadequate, and the military offensive in Gaza, they said, was disproportionate and egregious. And for the first time, the threat was not just diplomatic. These countries raised the specter of concrete actions, including economic sanctions on Israel. Even Germany, Italy, Japan, and 18 other governments not usually seen as critics, echoed calls for Israel to fully reopen aid access under UN supervision. Canadian sanctions had already been quietly building for years, targeted at the Israeli settler movement in the West Bank. Now, France openly questioned whether its relationship with Israel within the European Union might have to change. The Israeli government's blind violence and blocking of humanitarian aid have turned Gaza into a place for dying, not to say a cemetery, said France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. The pressure reached Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself. In a video address, he acknowledged that our greatest friends in the world were warning. They could not tolerate further images of mass hunger. Yet within his own government, hardliners demanded no aid at all, fearing any supplies would help Hamas more than civilians. Netanyahu tried to walk a dangerous tightrope, resuming what he called minimal aid, enough to appease allies but not enough, critics claimed, to slow the crisis. U.S. influence was shifting too. Once, Washington's support for Israel was ironclad, a bipartisan consensus. But now, even some voices within the Trump administration voiced concern about the hunger crisis, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitting, "We cannot simply look away if children are dying on our watch." What about the future? Reconstruction needs now top $53.2 billion just to restore what existed before 2023. Some policymakers dream of a Marshall Plan for Gaza, but with the EU threatening to review its trade agreement with Israel and the U.S. torn between competing domestic pressures, funding is far from certain. At the same time, the world debates whether massive aid shipments simply enable dependency or whether current restrictions have manufactured that dependency as a form of leverage. Professor Robert Patman of Otago University observes, "The call by 22 countries for Israel to allow aid into Gaza was in part due to mounting public outrage. Millions across the planet now see the disaster play out in real time on social media, fueling protests and shifting the calculus of Western capitals. Yet the core dilemma remains: how to deliver enough aid to prevent famine while keeping it out of Hamas's hands, and doing so in a war zone, with the risk of looting or airstrikes never far away. Even proposals for cash transfers or maritime corridors face logistical and political obstacles. And so, on May 20th, with only about 100 aid trucks expected to arrive, when the real need is 500 per day, the world finds itself at a crossroads. The UN refuses to participate in an aid plan it sees as weaponized. Israel's allies threaten unprecedented economic penalties. And inside Gaza, 14,000 babies wait, their lives hanging in the balance as food and medicine sit within arm's reach, yet still out of reach. How did Gaza become the stage for this collision between humanitarian necessity and international political survival? Will the pressure from powerful nations force Israel to open the floodgates, or push the region into an even deeper crisis? And what will happen to Gaza's people, trapped in the middle? Are they destined to remain victims of this global standoff, or is there still hope for relief and reconstruction? The next chapter in this crisis is unfolding right now, and the world holds its breath. The situation facing Gaza today is not just a tragedy measured in statistics or fleeting headlines. It is a turning point, a crossroads for the entire region, and perhaps the world, where decisions made in the coming weeks and months will determine the fate of millions and reshape the very contours of Middle Eastern politics. Let's peer into the uncertain future, where every scenario carries both risks and opportunities, and where the path ahead is anything but clear. The first scenario, and the one most fervently hoped for by humanitarian agencies, involves a sustained ceasefire that finally allows for massive reconstruction. This would mean not just trucks of food and medicine, but the international community coming together with billions in investment, over $50 billion according to estimates, to rebuild Gaza's shattered homes, schools, hospitals, and businesses. Such a move would require unprecedented cooperation among Israel, Palestinian authorities, the UN, Gulf donors, and Western powers. But make no mistake, the scale of coordination and trust needed here is immense. Yet even if this ideal scenario materializes, the challenges are formidable. As Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, warns, there are very, very hard discussions ahead. Western governments, battered by domestic politics and their own controversies, must decide whether to risk their alliances by pushing Israel harder. At the same time, Israel faces internal political rifts, with far-right leaders deeply opposed to any concessions they see as bolstering Hamas or weakening security. Is the world, and Israel's own government, truly prepared to commit to peace-building this time, or will old patterns reassert themselves? More bleakly, the second scenario, continued conflict and chronic shortages, looms larger with each passing day. If the current trend of minimal aid deliveries persists, with only a trickle of trucks entering Gaza instead of the pre-war daily average of 500, the crisis will spiral. UN experts have sounded the alarm. At least 14,000 babies are at imminent risk of death from malnutrition in the next 48 hours. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the WHO Director General, summed it up in chilling terms. People are already starving, sick, and dying, while food and medicines are minutes away across the border. International patience with Israel's restrictions is fraying fast. Canada, France, and the UK, once unwavering allies, are now openly threatening concrete actions, including sanctions. The European Union is debating a fundamental reassessment of its relationship with Israel. If Israel continues its hardline policy, a cascade of diplomatic and economic consequences could follow, further isolating the country and destabilizing old alliances. Yet for many in Gaza, these international debates are painfully abstract. A mother holding her starving child cannot wait for the slow churn of geopolitics. There is also a third, more experimental scenario being quietly considered: the creation of a new, more secure aid delivery system, potentially staffed by private contractors under U.S. and Israeli supervision. Ostensibly designed to prevent Hamas from redirecting aid, this plan is deeply controversial. Major aid groups have refused to participate, citing concerns about neutrality, efficiency, and the basic principle that humanitarian assistance should not be weaponized. Casper Veldkamp, the Dutch foreign minister, voiced his skepticism, and UN agencies have warned that such a system is unlikely to meet the scale of Gaza's needs. However, even in this uncertain space, innovation is possible. Experts suggest that alternative delivery mechanisms, such as UN-managed maritime corridors or conditional cash transfers that empower families to buy what they need, could create new models for humanitarian response. These would require robust oversight, participation from all stakeholders, and a genuine effort to build up local capacity. Could Gaza become a testing ground for the future of international aid? Or will entrenched politics doom these experiments to failure? No matter which scenario plays out, the stakes extend far beyond Gaza's borders. Every decision now will reverberate through the Middle East, influencing the region's security architecture, the credibility of international law, and even the global order that has governed humanitarian intervention since World War II. Yet amid these grand strategic risks, it's vital not to lose sight of the human dimension. Over 95% of Gaza's hospitals are now non-functional. The economy has collapsed by more than 80%. Nearly a third of families cannot meet basic education needs for their children. Jean-Noël Barrot, France's foreign minister, put it starkly. The Israeli government's blind violence and blocking of humanitarian aid have turned Gaza into a place for dying, not to say a cemetery. And as new waves of airstrikes and displacement sweep the territory, many fear that the current crisis could metastasize into a permanent disaster, one that not only robs Gaza's children of their futures, but sends shockwaves into neighboring Egypt, Lebanon, and beyond. For Israelis, too, the choices are agonizing. The trauma of October 7th, when Hamas militants killed over 1,000 people and abducted hundreds, remains raw. Security fears are deeply felt, yet the world is watching, and the costs of ongoing isolation could mount quickly, threatening Israel's own long-term interests. There are, however, rays of hope amid the devastation. The international outcry, including from Israel's closest friends, is unprecedented. More than 22 countries have signed on to calls for the unrestricted delivery of humanitarian aid. As Professor Robert Patman of Otago University notes, this surge in diplomatic pressure is itself a product of overwhelming public demand for action. The age of silent complicity may be ending. So what does this all mean for you, the viewer? The Gaza crisis is not a distant tragedy. It is a test of our generation's principles, compassion, and ability to effect change. First, it shows how interconnected our world has become. Political decisions made in the corridors of power or the negotiating tables of distant capitals have immediate life-and-death impact for people on the ground. Our voices, whether expressed through protest, social media, or the ballot box, can accelerate or impede those decisions. The pressure that moved governments to even threaten sanctions did not come out of nowhere. It arose from millions of ordinary people refusing to look away. Second, it's a stark reminder that humanitarian crises are never just about aid. When food, water, and medicine become bargaining chips, the world risks normalizing suffering as a tool of politics. This dynamic is not unique to Gaza. Similar cycles of blockade, aid dependency, and diplomatic paralysis play out in Yemen, Sudan, and beyond. By understanding the mechanisms here, the blockade, the politics of donor funding, the logistics of distribution, we can spot the early warning signs in other crises. Informed citizens are better equipped to hold their leaders accountable. Third, this crisis highlights the limits of charity alone. For decades, Gaza has relied on external aid. But true recovery and resilience require the freedom to build a functioning economy and the dignity to provide for one's family without depending on handouts. Sustainable solutions must focus not only on immediate relief, but also on long-term reconstruction, infrastructure, education, and economic opportunity. Whether you're a policymaker, a journalist, or simply someone who cares about justice, remember, advocating for self-sufficiency and dignity is as important as calling for more aid. So how can you use this understanding? Stay informed and don't settle for oversimplified narratives. Ask hard questions about where your government stands and what your society is doing to support peace. Amplify credible voices, like those of UN officials, health workers, and local Gazan leaders, rather than relying on polarized soundbites. Support organizations that adhere to humanitarian principles, and scrutinize those that treat aid as a tool for leverage. On a practical level, your choices matter. Even small actions, signing petitions, writing to representatives, spreading fact-checked information, can help sustain the pressure that is now forcing world leaders to rethink old habits. The groundswell of international concern that we are seeing today started with ordinary people refusing to turn the page. In conclusion, will global pressure force Israel to change course, or will Gaza's crisis deepen further? The answer, at least for now, is that the tide is turning, but not fast enough. The resumption of minimal aid and the threats of sanctions show that the world will not tolerate indefinite suffering. But unless these measures are followed by decisive, coordinated action, full reopening of aid channels, a meaningful ceasefire, and a serious commitment to rebuilding, Gaza may yet sink from the edge of famine into a catastrophe. Crucially, the fate of Gaza is entwined with that of the entire region. The longer the world delays, the more entrenched the conflicts become, and the harder it will be to turn the page to a future of coexistence and stability. And here's a secret fact, often overlooked. The Gaza blockade was originally intended as a temporary measure, a short-term fix in the eyes of policymakers 17 years ago. Yet as history has shown, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary solution left unchallenged. The responsibility to end this cycle lies not just with governments, but with all of us who refuse to look away. If you found this analysis meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspectives and ideas. What do you think needs to happen next? Can the world finally break the cycle and deliver real hope to Gaza? Or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes? Let's keep the conversation going and, together, hold our leaders to account for the lives and futures of millions who have waited far too long.